Thank you very much, Ella. Because I know not everyone gets through Ulysses, I thought I'd start with a tiny summary of the book. Not a lot happens in it, but everything happens in it. It's based on three central characters, although there's hundreds of people in the book, but there's three important characters. Stephen Dedalus, Leopold Bloom, and Molly Bloom. It's broken up into 18 episodes. It's loosely based on Homer's Odyssey. There's no titles, but the chapters get given titles because people link them to each of the episodes of the Odyssey. Stephen is an artist. He's looking for for some kind of father figure in his life. He's got writer's block. He's got ambitions of greatness, but he hasn't had a bath for a year. Bloom is an ad salesman. He's worried that his wife is about to have an affair with Blazes Bolan. He's lost his father and his son. Molly Bloom, his wife, is going to have the affair. She's not had penetrative sex with her husband since the death of their son 11 years ago. That is significant. Stephen goes for a walk. Bloom goes for a walk. He's very busy on his walk. They only meet properly in episode 14, which is the most difficult chapter of the book, Oxen of the Sun, which is slightly peculiarly set in a maternity ward. They meet in a maternity hospital, and it's quite difficult to read. They go to a brothel. They go home to Bloom's. They piss in the garden. They look at the stars. Bloom goes to bed. Stephen goes off somewhere. Molly wakes up, and then she has a 62-page soliloquy, which is 8 sentences. She says yes a lot of times in that soliloquy. There's lots of different styles in the book. Chapter 14, which is the one in the maternity hospital, is written in 32 different styles of English. And kind of working out when it jumps from Old English to Middle English is... Initially, I think those of you who've read it, it's very annoying. But it's about the birth of language, and so that's what he's doing. It's very long. Another chapter, chapter 15, is a play. Episode 17, it reads like a catechism. But there are great moments of joy and humour in the book. So that's kind of my summary. So if you don't know anything, you know that now. So from the outset, Ulysses was heralded when it was published in 1922 by many of the kind of critics of the day as a literary masterpiece and a modernist landmark. Influential critics immediately grasped its significance. Ezra Pound, who's a poet and a critic, he called the book an epoch-making report on the state of human minds in the 20th century. T.S. Eliot, also a modernist poet, in his review he said, "The book heralds the end of the novel form and anticipates the future of modern literature. He called it the most important expression which the present age has found, from which none of us can escape." Not everybody loved the book. Virginia Woolf, in her diary, although she actually does go on to copy the book a bit, but in her diary she says it is an illiterate, underbred book. And then she goes on to say it's a book of a self-taught working man. That's like the most terrible thing she can say. His own aunt said it wasn't fit to read, and to which Joyce kind of replied, well, if it isn't fit to read, then life is not fit to live, which I think is a really great kind of quote about what the book is about. It continues to top the charts. It sells about 100,000 copies every year. It's voted the best book of the 20th century again and again and again. I think The Great Gatsby usually comes second. It is a subject of thousands, I'm sure, of PhD theses. So why does the book stand out? What makes it so great? It was published at the height of modernism, but obviously the modernist era predates 1922. It has its origins in at the end of the 19th century, and as a movement, it was a reaction against the moral and institutional decline that we discussed yesterday with Sheila's book. It's also a reaction against a world that is seen as increasingly alienating in a new industrial era. It was a very self-conscious movement in the arts, and it spanned the arts. You can see it in painting with Picasso, Kandinsky. You can see it in music with Stravinsky, architecture, and obviously literature. And if you were to take the characteristics of modernism, it's known for rejecting the conformity and rules of the past. It's known for experimentation, invention and reinvention of new forms. It privileges the present, the modern, the new, and it reflects sort of the fragmentation and alienation that we talked about, that I talked about just now, and it promotes a sort of more individual perspective rather than overarching narratives. The whole modernist movement kind of took a slightly different shape once the Great War, the First World War, got started. And the reaction actually kind of made the movement somewhat more gloomy. There's a greater sense of despair and introspection. There's a loss of the faith in God, government, and basic human goodness. And so in 1922, alongside of Joyce's book, you also get the publication of the great poem, The Wasteland, by T.S. Eliot, which is just a fantastic poem. But it is a very fragmented, sort of melancholy poem about, a world that seems to have no meaning. So Joyce wrote the book in the war years. That's what he did during the war. He wrote Ulysses. He started in earnest in 1914, which was the same year he was introduced to Ezra Pound. And what Ezra Pound does is he coins the adage, make it new. He's very into the new. And he's an important catalyst for modernist literature. He edited and promoted a number of writers and encouraged publication. And he managed to get a publisher for Ulysses while it was still being written. He got it published in the Little Review, which was an American magazine starting from 1918, and episodes would appear in the magazine. But when the Little Review published the Nausicaa episode, which is the 13th chapter, it's where Bloom is on the beach masturbating. If you haven't read the book, it's a very fun chapter. That's what got the book banned, and basically his writing was then banned in the Ulysses was then banned both in USA and the UK. Undeterred, Joyce continued to write the book, and he moved to Paris to finish it. He was there in the 20s, which was an era when there was a sort of what was coined the lost generation of writers, which we're all familiar with: Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Scott Fitzgerald. They were all in Paris at this time. And he finished the book in 1921, and he frantically was searching for a publisher. And eventually, Sylvia Beach, who owned Shakespeare and Company, which was a bookshop in Paris, she agreed to publish it. And that's significant because she wasn't really a publisher. And so in the book, there were lots of typos, some of which are meant to be there, some of which aren't meant to be there. So it's a kind of, it isn't a great copy of exactly what he wrote, but it's near enough, and there's all sorts of debates about it since then. So going on to the book, Joyce didn't set out to write a modernist masterpiece. He set out to write an epoch-changing book. That's what he basically wanted to do. He wanted to write something that was significant, to capture the moment and change the world. That's what he's trying to do. He uses the tools of modernism, which are very important to create the book, but he wanted something to define an age and change the times that we live in. And he tells us this repeatedly in his writings. Because in his writings, whenever he's writing about Stephen Dedalus, it's kind of autobiographical about himself. So Stephen Dedalus, who appears in the prequel, which is the portrait of the artist as a young man, the book ends with Stephen going to Paris and promising to write a great work. Stephen says, "I'm going to Paris to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race." So he's not modest. He wants to kind of write this great epic. And we see it again in Ulysses when Stephen is in the library and he's talking to all these poets, and he hasn't been invited in the evening to a sort of soiree where they're going to all be talking about things. But they start having a discussion about Shakespeare, and Stephen puts forward his own theories on Shakespeare. And then they start saying, well, will there, all these great writers are saying, will there be a new Shakespeare? And in the middle of this is in 1904, he says, I will write something in 10 years' time. I will be the new Shakespeare in 10 years' time, which I think is, again, you think 10 years' time, 1914, oh yeah, that's when he starts writing it. He also wanted to write something that would actually define Ireland, a new nation that was being created. And so he wanted it to be a book that would set the scene for Ireland. And he took as his start, and he wanted it to be like the Odyssey, like the Bible, like Dante's Divine Comedy, like Shakespeare's Hamlet, really epoch-defining book. And although he wasn't writing a manifesto, he wanted to write literature about how the world was. And in case you're in any doubt, he then basically has the audacity to take the Odyssey as his, the epic of the Odyssey, not some Irish novel, which all the Irish revivalists were doing at the time. They were going back to ancient Irish literature and trying to forge something out of that. He said, no, I'm going back to the Odyssey, which is the greatest epic of all time. It had a defining influence on Greek culture and then on Western culture, and that was the natural kind of progression of what he does. So when you start reading it, you're expecting this, if you've read Portrait, you're expecting this great epic. But when you start, it's almost like a bit of a parody. It is almost like a mock epic. Joyce recasts a hero as a seemingly unheroic everyman. He sets it in a modern city over the course of a day rather than 10 years. It's set on June the 16th, 1904. The episodes vaguely follow the Homeric structure, but all the action is set in Dublin and not in the high seas. But when you think about it, it could not be otherwise. This is an epic of the modern man, and it is the modern man living in the city. And so, that's really his starting point. And he takes, what he does is he kind of plunders other epoch-making literature from the past in order to say something new about the age. And that going back to literature, using history and coming back is a very important device, which I'll talk about a bit more. So, as I say, he begins the novel as a portrait, as a sequence to Portrait, and we'd left him. Stephen has now come back from Paris. He hasn't written his novel, but he has come back because his mother was sick and dying. And in many ways, Stephen Dedalus in the book follows the trajectory of the early modernist artist. He is like the early modernist artist. He's burdened with the kind of weight of the past, but he feels he's on the cusp of something new. He's grieving his mother's death. He feels very guilty about that because he didn't do what she wanted. He feels constrained and oppressed by two masters, the church and the British state. He's hanging out, in this kind of bohemian tower on the beach with a bunch of medical students who have lots of sort of intellectual debates of little or no consequence. In the second chapter, we see his reactions against the old institutions, and Joyce sets this up nicely. He reacts again. He's a teacher, but he doesn't really like teaching. He hates it really. He doesn't like the whole idea of rote learning and sees there's a useless nature of education in the way it was. He sees the boys going off to play hockey, which is a kind of foreshadowing of the boys going off to war, because in 10 years' time, these same boys will be the generation that goes off to war. And he experiences the authority figure of the principal, who basically just tells him a lot of lies, and so he can't believe what the elders are telling him. And then in the third chapter, which is the Proteus chapter, episode, Stephen is you really see Stephen as a troubled artist. He's trying to think about ideas and perspective and Aristotle, and he tries to write poetry, but he's completely paralyzed by his thought. It's much like the young Hamlet, who is, just kind of frozen by the kind of weight of thought and that's weighing upon him. He's struggling for autonomy, but he can't find it. he kind of says in the chapter, I shall not go back, meaning I will not go back to the tower. But he means I can't just go back to what I did. He knows he has to, he can't go back, but he does not know how to move on. And as the day progresses, his attempts to be creative are constantly frustrated. He's in the newspaper office. He's had to put a letter in there. And he's all these newspaper guys are telling a great epic story of a Irish kind of martyr to British imperialism. And he's kind of saying, well, you know, I've got a story as well. And then he tells this completely nonsensical story about some ants being up a column and throwing plum stones on everybody, and you're like, okay, what's that got to do with anything? So that's a kind of useless story. He then tries again. He's in the library with all these guys talking about Shakespeare, and he puts forward his theory about Shakespeare and Hamlet and Shakespeare's father and his wife, and it's all quite a convoluted story. But at the end of it, he just says, well, I don't really believe this, but, you know, it's a great story. And so he's trying to be creative, but he's just not able to do it. By the 15th episode, which is Circa, which is just before he starts hanging out with Bloom, he descends into a kind of drunken, self-destructive chaos. He smashes a chandelier, and you think that's the end of him. So the struggling artist, or the lonely individual in a world seemingly without artists was an important theme in Joyce. It was important in Portrait. It was important for other modernists, this sort of sense of, you know, being overwhelmed by things. And it is a theme that I think Eliot talked about, which led many modernists to very, very gloomy kind of conclusions. T.S. Eliot, who wrote, the wonderful poem, he retreated into faith and Catholicism. He couldn't really do anything. Ezra Pound became a Nazi. I mean, not just a fellow traveller, an absolute Nazi. And Virginia Woolf killed herself. So, they weren't exactly the most joyful bunch of people to hang out with. But in Ulysses, he doesn't get stuck in that kind of pessimism. In contrast to Joyce's earlier writings in The Dubliner and Portrait, the book takes on a more different and a more exuberant and optimistic theme. Clearly, the mature Joyce has developed, and he's got a distinctive perspective of the world. He doesn't retreat into nihilism. He's got his own take on the modern. I think that's partly because he's Irish, something we can discuss. But I think the fact that he's Irish and he's seen the destructive nature of nationalism in the First World War, but he sees, a nation on the cusp of something new, which is quite exciting. He also leaves Ireland, which he finds very oppressive, and he leaves Ireland in order to be free, and I think that gives him a sense of new and intangible. But he's also very engaged in the future. He saw possibilities with technology. And he was very inspired by the increasing literacy that was happening within Ireland. And so as an aside, he opened a cinema. He was very forward-looking. He thought it'd be great to have a cinema in Dublin, and he ran that for a few years. So he's forward-looking, and he has a different outlook, and he's trying to write this modern epic. And his first objective was really to move on from the past, to move on from Stephen, and to find a new way to express artistry. And so what he tries to do is to elevate the dignity of ordinary, everyday human experience. That's kind of his main focus. So his epic isn't just a mock epic. He believes that the modern hero will be found in ordinary modern life. That's what he means by modernism. He was very much influenced by the kind of jingoism and the false heroism that preceded the First World War. It's something that Frank actually talks about in his book. And he saw that as as something that was very problematic. And so he wanted to counter that with a different kind of thing. He understood that the obsession with false heroes and death sprang from a disillusionment of everyday life. So in response, he wanted to replace warmongering with a new kind of heroism. And he believed that by recording the minutiae of a single day, you could counter the false heroics of the warmongers. He thought that by recording the minutiae, you could expose the joys and pleasures and unexpected delights to be experienced in ordinary living. The story he writes is actually inspired by a real-life event, which is important, where he was actually rescued by a middle-aged Jewish man when he himself, Joyce, got into a fight. And it struck him as, it gave him a great belief in the goodness of people. And he saw ordinary people as the basis for civilization, and he wanted to reflect this in his writing. So he basically starts trying to examine the everyday, and he does this in his book. So after this kind of first 3 chapters where we've met Stephen, and he's at the beach, and he's in his funk, not really able to think about it, the book suddenly switches tack, and we go back to the beginning of the day, and we meet Leopold Bloom, who's our hero for the modern age. And it starts off with, you suddenly know you've been trying to make sense of what Stephen's thinking, which is very obtuse. And then suddenly you get this wonderful opening for the Calypso episode, which is our introduction to Bloom. He says, Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. He liked thick giblet soup, nutty gizzards, a stuffed roasted heart, liver slices fried with crust crumbs, fried hencock roes. Most of all, he liked grilled mutton kidneys, which gave to his palate a fine tang of faintly scented urine. You know from there that you're in for a treat. And then he explores the everyday life of Bloom. It's just a wonderful thing. You go to the bathroom with Bloom. You meet Bloom's cat. You follow Bloom's thoughts when he glimpses a little bit of stocking when he's out on his way to get his kidneys, the kidneys that he's having for breakfast. And in Bloom, you realise that his inner monologue is not like anything in the past. It's not paralysing, it's liberating. We see his empathy and his imagination, not this kind of self-reflective torture that had previously existed. It's not the suicidal soliloquy of Shakespeare's Hamlet, but the thoughts of the everyday. So when he goes out shopping, he sees an advert for tea, and it's called something like Black and Oriental, and he's Oriental, and he has this wonderful sort of daydream about going to the Orient and just thinking it's completely exciting. And it's not so much an inner dialogue, but a dual and triple train of consciousness. There's what's actually happening on his walk, what he's thinking, and then where his mind drifts off. And the whole thing is interweaved. So the thoughts go back and forth. There's wordplay, free association, and we also see the so-called obscene, or what was obscene at the time, the offstage, which is what it really means, his desires, his secrets, his passions. And the writing is groundbreaking. He becomes, this is a character who must be the most well-known character in literature. I mean, we know everything about his thoughts. And even the judge in the obscenity case in 1933 understood the artistry in this. He said, the case came up before him, and he had to read the book, and he had to keep putting off the trial because he hadn't finished it, which I'm sure will kind of relate. Some of you will relate to that. But anyway, he did read it, and he was particularly struck by the Molly chapter at the episode at the end. And he says, Ulysses is brilliant and dull, intelligible and obscure by turns. In many places it seems to be disgusting. But although it contains, as I have mentioned above, many words usually considered dirty, I have not found anything that I consider to be dirt for dirt's sake. Each word of the book contributes like a piece of a mosaic to the detail of the picture which Joyce is seeking to construct for his readers. And he went on, when such a real artist in words as Joyce undoubtedly is, seeks to draw a true picture of the lower middle class in a European city, ought it to be impossible for the American public to legally see that picture? And he lifts the ban. So, even the judge gets it. So it is a celebration of human experience. And we see our Searls there. It's positive, funny, and the most humanist trajectory that you could have. And I think what's really interesting is that he looks at the particular in order to find the universal humanity. And I think for a modernist, that's absolutely fantastic. But not only does he uncover the beauty of every day, he also shows us how to make sense of the world. By going back to the Homer, sparks a new way of him understanding things. In the past, if you read his older stuff, he has this notion of epiphany, that the way you see things is through epiphany, that you have this sort of moment where things come together and you suddenly see them in a new way. And he stresses it's a human thing, it's not godlike, it's not from the outside, it's human imagination and insight. But in Ulysses, he tells us something more than this. He tells us that an intense instance of imagination is an insight across and into time. I'm going to explain this a bit more. Stephen tells us in the library, in his kind of, totally impenetrable language, he has a flash of brilliance. And he says this, so bear with me, because it's not the most straightforward. He says, so he's talking about, understanding. And he says, so in the future, the sister of the past, I may see myself as I sit here now, but by reflection from that which then I shall be. Which is not, the most straightforward thing to see. But what he's really saying is this is a great insight into how we come to understand things. Everything we do acquires a more durable meaning in belated recognitions. When you look back on it, you see it in a new light. And that's what he's really doing. And it's interesting because Frank did exactly that in his introduction on the first day, where he said, I went back to Fukuyama, I found this. I don't know why I didn't see it before. But actually, that's how we really come to understand things, is by going back and reflecting upon them and using our experience to make sense of them. Stephen is not yet able to do anything with this insight. It's just there. But the great thing in the chapter is Bloom puts his head round the pillar. He's in the library for a completely different reason. They don't meet, but he puts his head round the corner. And you get this sudden understanding that Bloom is really the older Joyce looking back on the moments of the young Joyce. Bloom is like the older figure coming back to look at what's going on. And so, this is an important insight, and Joyce turns to Bloom to explore this very much more. When he was writing his book in Serial, before it got banned, he had quite a fan base, and people wrote to him and said, we want more chapters on Stephen. Stephen's great. Can we hear more about Stephen? And he says, no, I'm bored with Stephen. He said, Stephen no longer interests me. He has a shape to him that cannot be changed. Bloom, on the other hand, is flexible rather than intransigent. So he rejects Stephen's sort of intellectual stasis in favour of Bloom's dynamic interplay of thought and action. And so you see Bloom. He's dealing with problems all across the day. He's trying to avoid Molly because she's having an affair, but he can't really escape her in his thoughts. And he returns to many thoughts again and again. His son, Rudy, who died at 11 days. His father had committed suicides. And all of these ideas come to play on him. And he allows belated recognitions and new experience to come into play to reevaluate and put everything in perspective. He never actually thinks about Molly. There's no soliloquy where he sort of says, I now get it, it's fine, she's having this moment. It's just little thoughts all the way through the day. And I'm going to kind of cut back, but there's a sequence to what he looks at. He looks at what it's like to be a woman. You see him being empathetic. He even imagines himself as a woman. He thinks about female sexuality. He thinks back to his first date, not consciously, but things remind him of that. When he goes back to the house he even replays the whole day in the Circa episode, which is in the brothel, which is, again, reliving and reevaluating in the form of a kind of semi-waking nightmare. And he kind of then is able to put the affair in perspective. And he sort of, at the end of the day, he looks at the stars with Stephen and he says, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's kind of, there are worse things that can happen than her having an affair. And probably it's my fault because I haven't been able to have sex with her for 11 years. And, I really kind of have to put it in perspective. And there's that kind of reevaluation of his fears. And it's a form of, and so what Joyce is doing is he's using a form of kind of relativism, I suppose, if you like, but to get at the truth. Often relativism is about not the truth, it's about finding lots of truths, whereas Joyce is trying to show you that you can look at things from different perspectives in different ways and find a truth that allows you to develop a kind of equanimity. Okay, final thing. So the final kicker of the book is that in order to read Ulysses, though, Joyce has to create a new kind of reader. He basically wants you to read in a different way in order to understand his insights. And so he basically has to teach us to read Ulysses. He wanted ordinary people to read the book. It's not meant to be this thing that people only read for PhDs. It's meant to be a book that every ordinary people... He gave a copy to his waiter, and he wanted people to read it. He had high hopes that children that he saw on the street would be readers of Ulysses in the future. But to do this, you have to read in a different kind of way. And, people say, well, you have to read Ulysses to be able to read Ulysses, which is like, what does that mean? But what he means is that you have to read it in order to learn how to read it. At first you read it and you bumble along like Bloom. You kind of have these lovely little snippets of the day, and it's like, oh, well, thank God we've got this little wonderful description here, because I haven't got a clue what that last bit meant. And it's like you're Bloom, you're bumbling along and you think of the Orient, it's like that. But then you have to do more, and there's a reason why there's so many guides to Ulysses. It's because it's a book that is written to be reread. I mean, that is the whole point about it. And so he tells us in little hints, I'm going to do it very quickly, ways to read the book. Really early on, when he's in the church, which is the Lotus Eater chapter, he basically says he's telling us there's a lot more going on than you think. And so he's watching the Latin Mass, and he says, and he kind of translates the Latin, and he goes, oh, that's kind of beautiful. But he says, would probably make a lot more sense if I knew what it was all about. So he can understand the Latin, he understands the words, but he doesn't, he's Jewish and he's meant to be Christian, but he doesn't really know what's going on. And I think that's one clue, is that there's layers in this book. And once you understand what's going on, you understand more in it. It's also non-linear, like no other book. You have to read it and then reread it constantly. So, he'll do things and you're like, what's that about? And then you'll find it later on in the chapter. And I think if you read the first two paragraphs of Proteus, which I'm not going to read out now because they're completely dense, which is the third chapter of the book, you can see that you do not know. It is impossible to decipher what the first paragraph means. You then read the second paragraph and you're like, oh, we're talking about Stephen. Oh, and he's talking about Aristotle. And he's actually thinking about what it's like to see. But, none of that is written. You have to kind of read like that. And that's what he's trying to ask us to do. You have to appreciate, and then there's other things he does. He shifts perspectives, and style is always important. Every time he talks about Irish nationalism and the Irish revivalists, it suddenly becomes this flowery, diddly-dee kind of, writing. And he's kind of showing the limitations of what he's doing. Anyway, all of these tricks turn us into active readers, and that's what he really wants. There's endless puzzles, there's no signposts, he's taken out all the quotation marks, but he wants you to make it your own so that you understand it. He wants it to be fun, and it is, once you get the tricks to it, it is really liberating, looking for the clues and the solutions. And I would argue that grappling with the novel's challenges, the reader is pushed towards the most important reward of all from reading Ulysses, which is thinking independently.